Hello and welcome to the Cage Review podcast, the first ever Cage Review podcast with me, Ross Williams. UFC 209 this weekend, this Saturday, and just the second pay-per-view of the year, and, despite being in March, and it's got a lot to live up to, I would say. We'll start with that. UFC 208 was, in fail of a better word, a disaster, really, for the casual fans. Didn't really have anything, not much promotion, really. Holly Holm obviously has something for the casual fans, being the person that beat Ronda Rousey the first time around, but there really wasn't much going for it. It was a title fight which no one really cared about. Jermaine Durandame is not a big name, despite a fantastic Muay Thai background, to be fair. And even the undercard was pretty average. Anderson Silva's always a big name, but he's not the same fighter he was against a Derek Brunson, who again, not really a big name. It was nice to see Jacare Souza on there, but he should be having bigger fights at this time. He's earned bigger fights. UFC 208, bit of a disaster really for Dana and the UFC as a whole. So 209 has got a lot to live up to, but I reckon it certainly has the potential. So certainly top 208. Maybe pay-per-view of the year, because there's so many good fights in there. The main card is absolutely stacked, and you've got two title fights which could potentially be, match of the year contenders. Obviously, the main event: Tyron Woodley defending the welterweight strap against Stephen Thompson. The rematch from 205 should be an absolute belter if it's anything like the first one. Obviously, the first went 25 minutes. How Thompson lasted 25 minutes, I've absolutely no idea. But it's two warriors going at it, and it should be a really great fight. And then you've got the co-main, which, to be honest, is big enough. It would be big enough to main event any pay-per-view by itself. You've got Khabib Nurmagomedov against Tony Ferguson for the interim lightweight belt. Basically a title eliminator. No one really knows what Conor's doing, but the winner should potentially go ahead to face Conor McGregor in what would probably be the biggest fight of whichever year that takes place. But Khabib and Tony is huge. Khabib said this week it's probably the biggest lightweight fight in UFC history, and it's certainly up there. You're talking about the top three, without doubt. Then there's the other three fights. You've got Mark Hunt taking on Alistair Overeem to kick things off, which is an interesting one, really. You've got Mark Hunt currently filing a lawsuit against the UFC, against Dana White, because of what happened at UFC 200 with Brock Lesnar about his steroid use, PEDs. Going up against Alistair Overeem, who he's clean nowadays, but back in his Pride days he was prime suspect number one, without a shadow of a doubt. It's an interesting matchup, and it's a heavyweight division that's interesting at this time. You've got JDS going up against Stipe at 211 for the title, but below that, no one knows what's going on with Kane at the moment. The Doom's future's up in the air. Derek Lewis is probably the man coming through thick and fast, and he's hoping to take on the winner of this fight. So this should be a really big one. Two interesting styles. Mark Hunt, both fighters with that knockout power. It's going to be a really interesting fight, and a great fight to kick off the main card. You've got Venata versus Tamer, who's again just a really solid fight. Not big names, you would say, but certainly one for the purists. It's a great fight. Maybe not one for the casuals as such, but a very, very interesting fight there on the main card. And then you've got Rashad Evans against Dan Kelly. No one really knows what's been going on with Rashad Evans for the last few months. Sorry. He's been slated for the last two UFC cards, been pulled off both by the commissions. It's been a little bit interesting with Rashad Evans, so it's going to be interesting to see how he comes back after this time. In post-pitch and Instagram and anything, he looks absolutely stacked, so that's not a problem physically. But he's getting on in age, and is he a real contender nowadays? Don't really know, but maybe he can prove himself. 209 with a big win. In terms of how I think the fights are going to go, we'll stick to the two main ones. the co-main first. Khabib, I mean, he's not been beaten, has he? You know, he's so good. He's really so good. The wrestling is absolutely fantastic. You know, training with guys like Dan Cormier, you know, it's going to happen. But his wrestling's fantastic, and Tony's just got to find a way to get past that. If he can get past the wrestling and can keep Khabib stood up, then, you know, Khabib has been rocked. He was rocked last time out. Not the first time we've seen it either, although it was probably the most obvious example of Khabib being rocked. So if he can keep it stood up, then it's going to be a really interesting scrap, but most likely it's going to go to the floor. And, you know, they say when Khabib gets hold of you, it's very, very difficult to get anywhere. It's very difficult to get on top, and you just can't. As much as, unlike Tony, I think he's a great fighter, I think if Khabib can get any kind of momentum on the ground, then it's probably a good night. And as far as the UFC go, from a business perspective, as much as Tony is great, as I say, Khabib winning probably is what's best for business, because then, I mean, you've got potentially McGregor versus Nurmagomedov. You can do that in Russia if you want. Either way, it's going to be an absolutely massive fight for the belt to make the undisputed lightweight king, and that'll be absolutely fantastic. But likewise, if Tony can find a way to win, that's another great fight, because it's going to be an interesting matchup with Conor. Yeah, it's just going to be a really great co-main, and like I say, that fight is big enough to headline a pay-per-view all by itself. It does not have to be the co-main event in this one. They could have saved that for 210, whatever they wanted. As for the main event, the first fight was interesting at 205 because Woodley's wrestling is outstanding. Like, it's some of the best we've ever seen in the UFC. I mentioned Dan Cormier in Khabib's camp. You know, Dan Cormier is one of the very best ever. Johnny Hendricks was fantastic back in the day. Still looked alright the other week, to be fair, against Hector Lombard. Granted, fighting at 185 now, but Tyrant, he's just got the physical attributes are just absolutely outstanding, and it's very difficult to deal with that kind of wrestling. But then you've got Stephen Thompson. You've got Stephen Thompson, one of the best pure strikers I think you can say we've seen in the UFC again. You've got two absolute masters of the craft here, you know. It's going to be fantastic. In the first fight, if Woodley had have taken it to the ground as much as he possibly could, like we've seen him do in other fights, I think Woodley takes it. I'm pretty sure Woodley takes the fight first time round, but he didn't. He stood up a hell of a lot with Thompson. It was strange, to be honest, whether he was just doing it to prove a point. I don't know. I don't see the logic behind that. You know, you're at Madison Square Garden, world's big stage, co-main event. You don't have to prove a point. You're already the champion. You do not have to prove any points. You just make sure you get that win. This time around, I can see Woodley shooting early, and I think if he does, it's going to be very difficult for Thompson. Thompson has got to pick his spots when they're upright, when they're standing, when they're trading shots. That's when Thompson's got to pick his shots. And you know, you never know with Stephen Thompson. He can just pull it out of the bag. He's so technical. He sees everything nearly a second before it happens. He's really, really fantastic. And while they're standing, Thompson might just nick it. However, I do think Woodley, the physical specimen that he is, and like I say, I do think they're going to shoot. I do think he's going to shoot early. If they get us on the ground, if he can get his wrestling going. Thompson's great. Thompson's got a good ground game, but I think Woodley's just too big. He's just too strong, too physical. And I think Woodley will be retaining the title, which, you know, sets up a whole load of possible scenarios there at 170 going forward. Either way, it's going to be a fantastic night of fighting. Obviously, doesn't have much to live up to after 208, but I think it's going to blow that one completely out of the water and really set us up for a good few months of fighting, with 210 looking strong, 211 looking very strong with 2 title fights on it. Yeah, I think it's going to set us up for the summer with some really great UFC action. So that's the end of our preview. Cheers.